I'm Dr. Catherine Ibbett. I teach in French and comparative literature here in SELCS. And I'm scheduled to talk to you today about studying literature, which is a contentious term actually for me, because I work on 16th and 17th century writing, is what I usually say. And that's a period at which things have not been siphoned off and decided to be literature as apart from other forms of writing. So it's a period when what we would now call literature, science, history mingle together. There are a great deal of sort of new forms of erudition, new forms of learning, where people are doing all kinds of different forms of writing in different configurations. And one of the things I'm really interested in teaching here, and that I've been able to do at UCL, in part because there are so many great institutions in London to work with, like the V&A for Decorative Arts and the Grant Museum of Natural History here at UCL, is think a little bit about the ways those forms of learning worked in the 17th century by asking students to look at literary texts and objects or scientific specimens and things like that in relation to each other. So I do quite a lot of teaching in conjunction with curators, where we go into museums. I have a class, for example, where we study a really weird text from the 1670s that's an anatomy of animals that happen to die at Versailles, that like lions, because they don't handle the cold so well. And they're anatomized and described, and this text talks at some length about what it means to do a natural history of animals. And so I ask my students to talk about what the natural history means in the 17th century with the people who run the Natural History Museum here, and we get some conversation going across disciplines and across styles of learning. So that's to say that for me, literature is always going to be a slightly strange term, and the things that we do in the literature classroom are going to be rather mixed. They might not look like a play or a poem, though I do a lot of that kind of canonical teaching as well. One of the things I'm really interested in, because it was a big deal in the period I teach in, is writing on stuff, on objects. So, for example, I've done some work with the Fan Museum at Greenwich, which is a really fabulous little museum I highly recommend a visit to. And they have some collections of fans, as in things we could probably all use in this room today, where there are poems written on various struts of the fan, various parts of the fan. I'm also interested in texts, writing that's carved onto boxes, little objects, so that you open things up. And so we try and bring in those kind of very different objects. But the most common thing that is not quite literature in the traditional sense of it, or not maybe like the literature that you're studying in school, is the sort of pop-out. If you remember pop-up books from when you were a kid, this is a sort of fold-out version of that was really, I won't say common in the 17th century, it was popular in the 17th century. So in books, I wish I was allowed to bring one from Rare Books, but they wouldn't let me bring in books of this period that are about yay big, you'll often find fold-outs. You have to sometimes get permission and get a curator to come and help you fold them out. Fold-outs that are often maps or designs for costumes. One of my favorite fold-outs that I like to work with is a text about the history of Turkey that has some really fabulous fold-outs of costumes of people at the Ottoman court. And the one I want to talk to you today is a very famous fold-out map. So I hope that each of you has, do you guys have a handout? Everybody's got one? Okay, and you've all got a little piece of paper. So I've got for you here, this is the English translation of this famous map. This is what's called the Carte de Tendre, and it is the map of the Land of Tenderness that was in a novel published in 1654 in France, Madeleine de Scudéry's Clélie, which is a multi-volume novel. I don't make students read all the multi-volumes, it's about this big. But Clélie features this kind of fold-out map, and this was translated in 1678, I think, into English. That Restoration English culture was really fascinated by all these weird French texts. So what I've given you here is the English translation, since I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the teaching we do in Comparative. So you should each have this map. So it's called the Map of the Land of Tenderness. I'll just give you a minute. I usually teach in seminar style around a table, so it's kind of hard to get you guys to talk in this setup. But tell me what sort of map it might be. Do you have any ideas what we're looking at here? It's not a great reproduction, I'm afraid.
Is it a part of the body?
It's not, but it does look strangely anatomical, and since I do animal anatomies, but not human ones so much. Let me kind of get going telling you about the context of this, and then we can kind of work some more on the little bits of it. So it's the Map of the Land of Tenderness, and this is a novel about a figure called Clelia, who is just simply the best and most wonderful woman you'll ever meet, and she's repeatedly described that way in the novel. And Clelia, everybody wants to be her friend, and people in the novel ask her when you get a new friend, it's actually a good thing to think about at university, when you get a new friend, how do you get from new friendship to a really serious, tender form of friendship? And we tend to think now, when we say tender friendship, that means something romantic. But in fact, Clelia herself in the novel is quite insistent that tenderness can be, it's just a form of kind of proximity and intimacy. It's a deep friendship. It can be between women, it can be between women and men. It usually involves women in some setup or other, and that's actually really important in this novel. But it's not necessarily what we would call romantic. And so Clelia, describing this, describes a map that we fold out. So as you read, you fold the map out of the novel. And we've got these little characters here, and they are the new friends. And you see in the bottom right-hand corner, it says the leagues of friendship. So it's as though that friendship is a kind of quantifiable unit that we can work out whatever that would mean, right? We have 8 leagues of friendship to get from this stage of friendship to the next stage of friendship. And so you begin friendship at new friendship here, this little village, and there are 3 routes to friendship, to tenderness, sorry. We've got up here tenderness on recognition, and tenderness on esteem is how they translate it in English. And here, tender on inclination. This is the river of inclination. So there are 3 ways to get to tenderness from new friendship. You can take this route, or you can take this route. What strikes you about this route, the inclination route, compared to the others?
It's already mapped out.
It's already mapped out, right? You get straight there. It's pretty easy to follow a river. As it happens, I'm doing a research project on rivers right now, but that's not why I like this text. So you go straight from new friendship to tenderness along river. Boom. And if you go too far beyond tenderness, you can overshoot its rapids, basically, and you end up up there, the dangerous sea. So if you can overshoot tenderness and end up somewhere dangerous, what kind of friendship might this be, do you think? Thinking about the ways in which people might expect women to behave. Yeah. It's kind of intense like jealousy, I think it certainly would involve jealousy. So what it is it says inclination. Inclination is basically a 17th century French term that means being really attracted to somebody. So this is the kind of, I fancy somebody, so I start off at new friendship and I get to tenderness too fast, and the danger is you can shoot right beyond that into the dangerous sea, and you end up in terre inconnue in the French, countries undiscovered. So that's the kind of sexuality route in friendship, which is, the map is quite insistent, a really dangerous route to follow. Though this term inclination is kind of one of the most important in novels of this period. But what about the other 2 routes? So remember I said that there's a kind of more, it's not just romantic friendship that we're looking at. We've got tenderness on recognition and tenderness on esteem. Can you make out the names of the villages that you pass through? What kinds of routes are we following there?
step by step, so you might send a note and then another note.
Yeah, exactly, step by step. So this gives you a map to follow when you have a new friend and you want to intensify that friendship. So you can start out here with pleasing verses, a gallant letter. Gallant is a term in this period that means kind of courtly and highly ritualized. An amorous letter, then you show sincerity, a great heart, honesty. And so you could kind of map yourself league by league route to get to tenderness on esteem. Esteem is a kind of admiration term in this period. So you will see how you can go up this kind of respectful, paying court to somebody route. But what's the worry? You see how you can get off the route almost immediately. Yeah. Negligence, right. So if you kind of goof up, basically, and forget to do pleasing verses or a letter early on, then you're negligent. And you go, we think of negligence now as a legal term, right? That it implies some kind of contract. And this is as though friendship is a kind of contract. If you're not doing things in the proper way, then you get very quickly into dangerous lukewarmness, lightness, forgetfulness. And then you see you get beyond forgetfulness into the lake of indifference. I really love that. I used to have a poster of this on my door, and one day I came back and found somebody had drawn a little swimmer in the lake of indifference. I always kind of wondered what was going on in their love life that made them draw that at that time. So you see it's really, really fine, the distinction between the right route to friendship and the way that you can get off track. And then on the other side, I always think of this a bit more like being friends with your colleagues, which I assure you we all are. You go from new friendship up to, maybe not through submission, but through small cares and assiduity, great services, tenderness. So you're doing things for each other, and there you end up on tender, on recognition. But if you wander off route there, you get into indiscretion, which does sometimes happen in institutions, perfidiousness, sort of gossiping about people. There's this fantastic rocky mountain here that's obviously really hard to get off from, which is the mountain of pride. And on the left here, this is the sea of enmity. It doesn't reproduce very well, and there's some kind of sea monster. So in maps of the sea at this period, there's a huge interest in showing the sea as a place of crazy shipwrecks and Leviathan-like figures, and you've got a sort of shipwreck whale thing going on underneath there. So you've got a whole social landscape here mapped out by this extraordinary woman novelist in the mid-century. What kind of advantages do you think there are to thinking about friendship and intimacy in this kind of way, to making it into a map? Does it seem socially helpful?
Is it showing you how to behave?
Yeah. Yes, step by step. But what might its advantages be over, say, so there are tons of books in this period that are called things like courtesy manuals, that are guides to how to behave. What's the advantage in making it into a map?
You have to read so many words.
Yeah, it's really, really immediate, and it gives you a kind of visual thing to hold on to, right? So this is something that is really crucial, I think, to think about the ways in which that written texts interact with visual experiences and often give rise to visual experiences. So this text in particular, this map, was really, really swiftly reproduced and pirated, basically. So it became printed on trays, it became printed, I really forgot the key image I should have shown you. It's still going. So this last year, this image was taken up by the designers at Gucci, and it was put on a dress which cost $6,000. I thought for a very long time about whether I was going to go with that, but I decided not to. I work on this image a lot, and it seemed really like I should have it. I felt like they should send me one. And the dress was worn by Michelle Obama on the Ellen show right before she finished being First Lady. So I felt like it got a really good airing, and I have been meaning to write to her and tell her how important this was in what my scholarly world was beside themselves with excitement at this point. So it still seems to be a map that speaks to people. And in fact, you'll probably, now you've seen it, see other maps that look like this. In the 19th century, for example, there were lots and lots of maps of a lady's heart and maps of a gentleman's heart. And so this becomes a kind of genre, the emotional cartography map. What does you think it says about the fact that this map is, she didn't draw it, she worked with an engraver that she worked a lot with, but that it's generated by a woman novelist who sets out these routes to tenderness? Is there anything we could say about women generating this kind of vocabulary for thinking about friendship and the emotions?
We're better at
Well,
and describing and...
I don't know if I want to make it into an essential thing, but I think historically it's certainly the case
We're not
that
afraid
in
of
this
discussing
period,
them,
I mean the history. So I work on what's called the history of emotions, and the history of the way in which women have come to be described as emotional is really interesting, but especially I think the ways in which they begin to describe emotions. So there are tons of books in this period written by men about the passions and how to govern them, squash them down. But Madeleine de Scudéry sets out this sort of use of the emotions and use of emotional behaviors in order to improve things. So I think there's something quite interesting about this naming of everything. If you name all the stages in a friendship, then it lets you say, I don't want that, I want this, right? I don't want you to be lukewarm towards me, I expect a love letter. So it gives you this kind of small degree, I think, of social agency, social power to expect. You should all go home and expect proper tender behaviors in the workplace, in your love lives, in your friendships. So I think that's quite important. And one of the things that's key about Madeleine Scudéry is she was really interested in cross-gender conversation. So this is from a text that she published in the late 17th century called Conversation, that shows her sort of ideal format for a conversation. It's a little bit like an open day, maybe a bit better dressed, where men and women walk around together talking. And so there are quite a lot of weird little texts that are generated from these occasions. There were people who kind of took notes, minuted the conversations that went on these events, and then those minutes get turned into other little snippets in novels. They often become bits of dialogue, and so on. So there's a kind of crossing between conversation and print as well that's quite important in this period. And I think the cross-gender nature of it is really significant. I often think of this as being a bit like the modern university, though again, better dressed. This is a picture from the late 17th century that shows one of these kinds of gatherings that Scudéry and her friends put together, where men and women gathered to talk about new developments in science and literature. This is actually from a fan, this kind of hand fan again, though it's a small painting. So people often made these little paintings that then would be cut out in order to fit onto the fan, and this one has not been cut, so it's survived as its own little miniature painting. And this shows the Jesuits, I don't know if you can see this properly with the light, so a Catholic order who's just recently returned from Beijing, where they've been setting up an observatory, and so they're showing the ladies in Paris these new scientific instruments and celestial maps and so on, and men and women are joining together to talk about these things. If you're thinking that the Jesuits don't look like regular priests, that's because they're dressed up in Chinese costume. It's like they've brought home their dress-up box or something. So I'm really interested in the ways in which these kinds of gatherings gave life to a sort of literature that mingles words, images, that draws on actual conversations, but that also gave rise to conversations, because you can see that this kind of thing very swiftly became a game. I made some of these up for an evening that I did at an institute recently where we played games that were generated by the salon. And so they had a kind of snakes and ladder format where you could make your way around the map of tenderness. You could get to goodness really fast, or you could fall down into the lake of indifference. This was a kind of weird setup. This was very short. I did this game evening very shortly after my mother had remarried, and so my new stepfather came to the thing, and he was playing the game in this group, and he rolled the die, so he very immediately landed on countries undiscovered. Remember the kind of dangerous sexuality thing where you go too fast? It's like, whoa, okay, I don't need to know about that. But so these kinds of texts are still giving rise to all sorts of conversations and ways of thinking about the period. Do you have any questions about this kind of working with literary texts and images, or working across materials, or about the materials themselves?
Could you just talk about how it ties in with different languages?
Oh yeah, that's right. So I am teaching. I actually have not yet taught on the new degree in Comp Lit, but I'm centrally involved in its organisation. So I teach in French and in the SELCS courses, which are usually taught in translation, and on the new Comp Lit degree, where we're talking about things in translation. And that works for the period I teach in really, really well, because the question of national language is still quite new in the 16th and 17th century. So a lot of the texts are themselves in dialogue with texts in other languages. They often quote things in other languages. In my research, I'm very interested in these kinds of texts you've probably seen, actually, called things like parallel texts, where you'll have a French story and then an English bit on the other side to help you kind of begin to read. And they were very common in the 17th century in particular. So I'm really interested in the way that a language or a literary tradition has always been in this kind of dialogue across language tradition. But I'm also, when I teach in French, and this will be true for other people teaching in the other national language traditions as well, I'm really concerned that language and literature kind of get taught together. So at UCL, at least in the French department, I can't speak for the other departments, we tend to separate out the exams, at least, that you do. The way the teaching is organized is you have language classes and what are called content classes. And that's just the way we organize things. Somebody's teaching translation and grammar, and then I'm teaching literature. But to a certain extent, that's a false distinction, because we're all teaching language when we do close readings of a text. So because I work in the 16th century, the French is really weird and thorny and curly. And by the 17th century, it's kind of calmed down a bit and been regulated. And so one of the things I like to draw students' attention to when we read is the changes in the language. I always forget this at the beginning of term because I have kind of professional goggles on, so I'm so used to the way that the historical language looks. That it's really good for me when students say, what's this word, or why is there an extra S there, or why isn't there the accent on it? And I have to kind of remember that this is shocking, in fact. And so I often get students to do a kind of reverse puzzle on the language so that you can see how the word has been re-engineered into something that we recognize today. So I think it would be common to many of us that we draw attention, because we're doing a lot of close reading in literature classes, that we're going to draw attention to particular verbal or grammatical forms that will help you on the other side as well. Does that answer your question?
And would your sort of literature be done already in the first year, or later on?
In French in the first year, we have a sort of survey course that's called Reading French Texts. And we do course texts from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. Shortish texts, and we choose them with some care for people's linguistic capacities at that point. So we have a short medieval text that's translated into modern French. We have a very funny 16th century kind of scurrilous tale. We have a 17th century tragedy. It kind of goes on like that. And that runs over the whole year. I really love teaching on that class. So it runs in big lectures, and then it breaks into small seminars, usually about 12 people around a table, and we work on a particular text over a couple of weeks. And so you're really looking at particular structures within that text. And because there's a sort of wide range of genres and different kinds of text, you're looking at, it's a kind of limbering up of everybody's literary techniques. It gives you the tools to dig into the work that you'll do later. So we designed that pretty carefully. It has, it's an exam class, and you do a lot of practice writing during the year, and that writing, I think, is still, it might have changed, I haven't taught it this year. It's largely taught by commentary, so you're doing close commentaries of particular passages or particular poems. So it's really, really a moment where we can hone everybody's abilities to talk convincingly and persuasively about texts. So we start from the sense that not everybody will have thought about literature in this way before, that people may be really a bit nervous about thinking about literature in another language, and we want to make sure that people are not bringing in an immense amount of sort of outside knowledge that they get bogged down in. It's quite common in first year literature classes that students panic and Wikipedia everything and tell you everything about when the writer was born and, you know, when they died, and a whole lot of extra opinion. And we try and kind of keep that to one side. We tell you some basics and give you some context, but we're really getting you to read the text itself and to think about how the text itself operates. One of the things I really like about that setup is it means when I teach second years, I know what they've done the year before. So I can say, when we encounter these slightly stranger texts, we're still encountering the same kinds of literary techniques, the same writing of a sonnet or the same sense of a dialogue or something. So I can say, remember that passage in Racine where, and they've all studied that. I know they've studied it in depth. So we can draw on that kind of common knowledge. And I think it creates a cohort when you've got that kind of shared material. Any other questions? It's always the parents who ask questions. So you might be students too. We would welcome that.
What are the language requirements for the course?
For admission,
Yes.
you know, you should ask Annika that. Are we talking about CompLit? Or the...
Yeah.
You know, I don't handle the admission requirements at all, so Annika will answer that better. But I think the